Ladies and gentlemen, Devya Sajjanal, a very good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this second edition of the Manav Rachna Law Dialogues. My name is Ajay Thomas, and I am the director of the Faculty of Law at Manav Rachna University. Uh, Manav Rachna University, we are a very young law school which is located in the Ravali Hills in Surajkund, and we are just into our third year of operations. The law school offers a 5-year integrated LLB honors program and also a postgraduate program in PhD and an LLM with specialization in commercial arbitration, IPR, and criminal law. The law dialogues, that is this Manav Rachna Law Dialogues, is a series of events comprising lectures, discussions, and seminars on a plethora of different aspects relating to the theory and practice of law, targeting not only lawyers and law students, but also the general public at large. This first event in the series of law dialogues was held on the 7th of March in the university on the topic internships, bridging the gap between expectation and reality. The success of the very first event gave us a great confidence to roll out more such dialogues. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the second event in that series of lectures. For today's dialogue, we will be looking at an overview of the anti-corruption laws in India. And to do justice to that topic, we could think of no better person than Mr. Vikas Pahwa, senior advocate and a doyen of the criminal law bar in Delhi. Now, Mr. Pahwa is probably known to a lot of you in practicing the law and those of you based in Delhi. But those of you who don't know about Mr. Pahwa has been in active practice for more than 25 long years. He's a third generation lawyer practicing in the Supreme Court and Delhi High Court. He was designated a senior advocate in 2011, and he has had long experience in advising clients on diverse matters relating to criminal, commercial, corporate, constitution, and family law. He's had opportunity to conduct many a high-profile case, both in India as well as abroad, including the Upahar tragedy case, where he very interestingly represented the victims on a pro bono basis. He was also involved in the Maruti Suzuki Manesar factory riot case. And most interestingly, he has also conducted a case at the Supreme Court of Greece. Now, ladies and gentlemen, along with a distinguished speaker for today is a young but extremely talented Divyakant Lahoti. Now, Divyakant has the onerous task today of moderating the session. Now, Divyakant, again, very interestingly, just like Mr. Pahwa, is a third generation lawyer who has had the great privilege of training and being guided and mentored by a former Chief Justice of India, Justice R.C. Lahoti. Divyakant is an advocate on record. He holds an LLM in international commercial law from King's College London, and has been recently voted as one of the bright, shining stars of the young bar in India. So, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Divyakant to take over the session. Divyakant, over to you, please.
Thank you, Ajay, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Divyakant Lahoti, and I will be moderating this session. The session is aimed to give an overview of anti-corruption laws in India with recent amendments and developments. I'm reminded of Mario Puzo in his iconic Godfather series, where he said that behind every great fortune, there is a crime. And India has suffered a fate which is no different. In this decade, India has witnessed amongst the worst scams relating to public procurement, resulting in unprecedented judicial orders cancelling such procurement contracts, be it 2G scam or coal scam, to name a few. According to Transparency International, India ranks 80 out of 180 nations in the Corruption Perception Index. In India, the law relating to corruption is broadly governed by Indian Penal Code and Prevention of Corruption Act 1988. The new amendments to the Prevention of Corruption Act were passed by both the houses of the parliament and received the presidential assent on 26 July 2018. Now, some of the key amendments which took place under the Prevention of Corruption Act relates to Section 7, which has been substituted with a new section, which now has made the definition of offense wider, which now includes all aspects of passive bribery, including solicitation and acceptance of bribe through intermediaries. Similarly, Section 8 has also been substituted, which makes any promise, offering, or giving of any undue advantage to a public official to refrain from acting in exercise of his powers a criminal offense. A very important development and substitution is in Section 9 and 10, which have been substituted to cover commercial organizations and persons in charge of such commercial organizations within the ambit of PC Act. Similarly, a new chapter, Chapter 4A, has been inserted, which specifically provides for confiscation of bribe and proceeds of bribery. And most importantly, Section 18 has been amended, which relates to sanction, which provides for protection of prior sanction by the government or competent authority to the persons who have ceased to be a public servant after bona fide discharge of their duties, so as to provide them a safeguard from frivolous prosecution. More recently, and in fact yesterday only, the Supreme Court in the case of State of Gujarat versus Mansukh Bhai Shah has held that deemed universities will be covered within the purview of definition of university under the PC Act, and thereby broadening the scope of public office. The Supreme Court has observed, and I quote, the corrupt societies often spring from the examples set at the highest level of government, but small scale corruption can equally be insidious. In this regard, the PC Act was formulated to bring about transparency and honesty in public life, as indicated by its objects and reasons. The court, although conscious of the present situation, took a pragmatic view and observed that although the anti-corruption laws are fairly stringent in India, the percolation and enforcement of the same are sometimes criticized as being ineffective. With this background in mind, we would request Vikas sir to address our participants. Now, participants are welcome to send their questions through question window, which would be appearing on their screens, which would be selectively answered by Vikas sir after his keynote address. Now, sir, with this background, I'll hand over the session to you, sir.
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking Mr. Ajay Thomas, Director, Faculty of Law, and also Mr. Divekant Lahoti, who has assimilated this entire webinar for the benefit of all our colleagues, the students of law and the young lawyers. And before I start the session, I would like to say that there is a silver lining in all adversities. And today we are quarantined at home. You know, the entire world is locked up in their own houses. We can't go out. The school and colleges are shut. The courts are not functioning. Businesses are not working. So production is not happening. And there's a silver lining in everything. I think the first silver lining is the benefit for the Mother Earth. Mother Earth is getting cleansed. Nobody is on the road. There are no pollutions. Then there are animals and birds who are having a great time. And as a human being, I think it's time that we should use this time and try to introspect as to what we have done in life, and whether we have treated the people who are around us rightly or not, and whether we have treated the environment in the right perspective or not. But coming back on the legal fraternity. So as a lawyer, I think the silver lining is the digital technology. Now, if you see what has happened post the lockdown, which started on 25th, and before that, even on Sunday 22nd, there was a total lockdown. We have seen that the digital technology has taken over the world. Now we get information on technology from what is happening all over the world on a click of a mouse in a computer, on the phone, we get all the information. And so digital technology has taken over the world. And the biggest advantage is a webinar like this, which we are, organizing today. And it is so nice to see that my colleagues, senior advocates, judges, they all are coming forward and they're trying to guide the youngsters, guide the junior councils, and guide the students as to what law is all about. So I think it's a welcome change, and I give full marks to the technology. So therefore, here we are making use of the free time which we have. I think this is the most productive time, according to me. We've been appearing in the courts off and on. We have been, at least in Delhi High Court, the hearings are happening through video conferencing, so we are spending some time on that. But I think the most productive in the last 35 odd days is the time which we are spending with our youngsters on the webinars. That's the most productive for us, as well as productive for our colleagues also. So, so we can start. I think Divyakant has given a very elaborate introduction to the Prevention of Corruption Act. The topic is an overview on anti-corruption laws in India. So anti-corruption laws in India are not restricted only to the Prevention of Corruption Act. There are many other laws. I will be discussing, I'll be giving some reference of those acts also, because at the end of the day, corruption is a worst disease. Corruption is like cancer, and once it seeps into the system, the entire system is jeopardized, and it is gradually deteriorated. So therefore, it is important for every country. Corruption is rampant not only in India but all over the world. Somewhere these scales are very high, somewhere the scales are very less. Divyakant has just mentioned that we are number 80 in the world. There are 79 countries which are better than us on Global Corruption Perception Index. So we are number 80, and we are being in this series from 75 to 82 in the last about 10 years. We have not improved much. So the anti-corruption laws which India has enacted in the last about say 100 years, I can give you the reference. In fact, before 1947 Act came, in IPC there were certain offences in which the accused were being prosecuted. Section 161 to 165A. There were 5 or 6 sections in which the corrupt people, the accused persons, were prosecuted. Imagine 1860. We are now in 2020, about 160 years. So at least on book, we have provisions to deal with corruption in our country. So 1860 till about 47. In 1947, the Prevention of Corruption Act was enacted. And then in 1988, the 1947 Act was repealed and 1988 Act took over. And there are some modifications. The biggest improvisation was in the definition of the word public servant, because public servant is now a very, very wide term. If we read 1988 Act, you will see many people are covered in this definition. As Divyakant has just referred, yesterday there was a judgment by the Supreme Court where the deemed universities are also covered. Normal universities were covered, but deemed universities are also covered. So that is very, very important. But why do we have corruption in our system? There is a very old story of Alexander Graham Bell. So story is that Alexander Graham Bell dialed the first wrong number when he made the third telephone. It is a very apocryphal story. We don't know the authenticity, but it makes a very significant point. The significant point is whenever you create a system, whenever you create an act, or you create a government, for instance, it is bound to be misused. It is bound to be abused by certain people. So therefore, the society should always be ready to fight with the abuse. In this case, the corruption, the corruption is as old as the government. I'm talking about ancient governments, I'm talking about modern governments. There was corruption even hundreds of years back. There is corruption even now. So let's see whether India has been in a position to curtail corruption as far as the laws are concerned, whether we have requisite laws in our country, whether those laws have been able to achieve anything, whether our conviction rate has gone up in the last about 100 years or not. That's the study which, that's the point which we can discuss today. So the corruption happens in the government because one of the primary reason is that the government, the resources of the government are entrusted to the public officers. All over the world, the government is run by public officers. These are called public servants. So the resources, the assets of the country, of the government are entrusted with the public servant. And they are susceptible, they are vulnerable to corruption because the private individual, the private parties, the companies who are trying to negotiate with the government or entering into contract with the government, they try to influence these public servants by offering them money, by offering them, other things that, like in 1988, now there is an amendment that word undue advantage has been introduced. Undue advantage covers both pecuniary and non-pecuniary. So today, the Act covers pecuniary advantage, advantage in the form of money, and also advantage which is not in the form of money. Like there are various instances, buying the first-class ticket for some relative, giving expensive gifts. All that is covered now in the Act. So the problem is that when a government servant who is paid a very meager salary of few lakhs of rupees, maybe 1 lakh, 1.5 lakhs, is given the assets worth about hundreds and thousands of crores. The assets, the contracts which they are signing is, thousands of crores. So the public servants are not properly paid. So when they are not properly paid, and when they see that they have the requisite power to deal with a contract worth about 1,000 crore, they become vulnerable and susceptible. So that's the basic problem. And the most corrupt countries are the developing countries because they have assets, they have resources. Just like we have coal block, there's a scam in coal block. We have, problem in 2G, 3G, 4G. These are all assets of the country, which are in the hands of the public servants. So when they are allocated, when they are sold to private parties who would like to make money out of this deal, then the corruption starts. So what are the acts which we have to deal with this? As I told you, 1860, we had 161 to 165A of the IPC, then we have 1947 Act. In 1946, Delhi Special Police Establishment Act was enacted. Delhi Special Police Establishment Act is the formal name of CBI. CBI is an agency which is constituted from an act. It's a statutory body. In 1946, this act was made, and CBI was given the power to investigate the matters relating to corruption. We have only two agencies. We have CBI and we have Anti-Corruption Branch. Anti-Corruption Branch is a state police organization. They deal with the corruption because it's a separate wing of the police of the state, and they can even investigate their own police officials. So we have CBI and we have the Anti-Corruption Branch. They are the only two authorities. This is one of the reasons why we have corruption in the country, because there are no private detectives, unlike in US and many other European countries. Their private detectives can also investigate and then give the evidence to the authority which is investigating. In our country, there's only two. You file a complaint with the CBI, sometimes they don't even act. So that creates a vacuum, that creates a situation where people are reluctant to report. Divekant mentioned about the graph where India stands. There's another study which has happened, which says that in our country, at least 55% of people have paid bribes. You'll be surprised. In 2017, the study says, this is India Corruption Survey of 2019 by Transparency International India. In 2017, 45% paid the bribe. In 2018, 58% paid the bribe. And 2019, 51% paid the bribe. So bribe has become like a routine matter in our country. So now coming back on the laws, what are the laws we have? So in a chronological order, I can tell you, we have PC Act, we have Delhi Special Police Establishment Act, we have Benami Transaction Prohibition Act, which came in 1988. And then we have in 2002, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, we have Black Money Act, and we have Whistleblower Protection Act in 2014, which was introduced. And then we have this, Prevention of Corruption Act Amendment Act, which my friend has just spoken about, that the entire act has now been, relooked and the provisions have been amended. So what are the kind of scams which have taken place in the last about 10 or 15 years? We have 2G scam, we have a coal scam, and we have a Commonwealth Games case scam where, in 2010, which also resulted into many FIRs under Prevention of Corruption Act. We have other society case in Bombay, so far and so forth. And we have the CBI versus CBI, when the senior most officer of CBI files a case against another officer of the CBI. That case is also there. There are many cases where senior officials of the banks and the government agencies were prosecuted. We have this case of Nirav Modi, we have Mehul Choksey, we have Vijay Mallya case. These are all cases under Prevention of Corruption Act. That's the foundation of those scams. And then come the prevention of money laundering, cases and etc. So how does a trap takes place? Let me just tell you, orally how it works. Nowadays, there are two kinds of traps. So this will cover the investigation part also. So the conventional trap is when a person who has a complaint against a public officer who's demanding money from him goes to the CBI or anti-corruption branch and informs them that there is an officer who's asking for bribe for giving a normal vote. So these are normal officials of Jal Board and Electricity Board, municipal corporation officials. They all ask for money. So if there is an aggrieved party, he can go to the CBI, file a complaint. That complaint should show that the public servant has demanded money. It should also show that this demand of money is for doing a job. It is for a consideration. It is for performing his official duty. So if that complaint is filed with the CBI takes the complaint and starts preparing for a pre-trap formalities. What are pre-trap formalities? Pre-trap formalities are when the CBI brings two independent witnesses who are not connected with this case at all, involve them in the trap. There is a trap laying officer. There is a shadow witness who will go with the complainant to the spot. And these are all in pre-trap formalities. This paperwork is done. And sometimes CBI also gets the conversation recorded, that when the complainant will go to an accused and makes a complaint and the accused demands the bribe, this is digitally recorded. It is video recorded sometimes from a distance. Normally it is audio recorded, and the audio equipment is given to the complainant. The complainant, along with the shadow witness and two independent witnesses, they go to the spot. They carry a currency note. That currency note is smeared with phenolphthalein powder. Phenolphthalein powder is a powder that if it is touched by someone and then there is a hand wash, the color of the water changes, which shows that yes, the accused has touched the currency notes. So that is, all this is done. The call is made to the accused is called, and a trap is laid where the bribe money is given to the accused. And when all this is happening, the signal is given by the complainant or the shadow witness, and the CBI or ACB, they go and arrest the accused person. Now this arrest has to happen only when there is a demand made by the accused person. That's called subsequent demand. Demand at the time of trial. That's a sine qua non. It's very, very essential. If there is no demand, there'll be no case. Because there are cases where complainants have filed a false case and deliberately try to give money to an honest man. So therefore, demand has become a sine qua non. The court says that it is essential. Now, when it is done, hand wash is done, hand wash is taken, it is sealed, Panchnama is prepared, and the accused is arrested and brought back, the investigation starts. Now, the investigating officer is a person who's authorized under the Act. Every officer cannot investigate the act of PC, Prevention of Corruption Act. Only those authorized officials. If you are with CBI, you have to be an inspector. If you are with ACB, you have to be a DSP. There are certain requirements under the Act. So then the investigation starts. And once the investigation starts, the investigating officer collects the material, sends the hand wash to a forensic. In case there's a tape recording done, then tape recorder has to be sent to a forensic expert. Forensic expert will give a report. That report is taken on record. Investigation concluded. All the three aspects: initial demand, demand acceptance covered, charge sheet filed in the court. This is the job of the investigating agency when it's a conventional trap. Now, what is happening nowadays? Conventional traps are less, and unusual traps, I'll just discuss with you what are those traps, are happening. They are on a rise because not many people are coming and reporting the matter to the cops. Not many people are saying that we are agreeing because they are participating. They have become accomplice along with the accused. So what CBI does is that whenever CBI has some source information, the CBI starts intercepting the telephone conversation of the complainant, the bribe giver, and the bribe taker. And those calls are intercepted. It's happening very, very rampantly in our country. CBI can go ahead and tap phone of anyone. They have to only satisfy the Ministry of Home Affairs that this is a case which requires investigation and some kind of crime is happening, and those applications are filed, permission is given. Now, those telephonic conversations are recorded. Whenever a deal is happening with regard to giving a bribe, a trap is laid, and both the parties are arrested at the spot. There are many cases like this which are happening in the country. So these are peculiar traps because no complaints are filed. There, the job of the CBI becomes very, very difficult because they don't have a complainant. One problem with the Prevention of Corruption Act cases is it's a victimless crime. Bribe giver and bribe taker, it's a mutually beneficial transaction. Nobody is aggrieved because the bribe giver is getting a benefit and bribe taker is abusing his official position, is getting money. But who's the victim? The victim is the government. Victim is the country. Victim are the people of the country because they are getting, deprived. If there is bribery and corruption going on, obviously the economy is affected. The real money is not coming. The contracts are not going to the right people. Contracts are going to the people who are close to the administration or those who are being given benefit by abuse of official position. So therefore, these kind of traps are happening, which are actually difficult to prove in the court because there is no victim. And what the CBI has today is only the telephonic conversations. They arrest the accused person. They take the voice sample of the accused person. Now the law is very, very clear that voice sample has to be given. Supreme Court recently has given a judgment that it is not violative of right of silence under Article 20, Clause 3. So therefore, samples can be taken. So once sample is taken, sample is matched with the voice of which is being tape recorded. Then that report is placed in the court and the charge sheet is filed. Now the law is against the investigating agency that this kind of telephonic conversation can be used only for corroborative purposes. It can't be the sole basis for filing a case and for convicting an individual. There is a great problem. Where do you get the independent material when the only evidence is a telephonic conversation? So what CBI does is CBI shows the telephonic conversation and also the movement of the file of the government. Suppose there are 10 or 15 conversations in a gap of 1 month, and during that conversation, the movement of file shows that it corresponds with the telephonic conversation. Then the movement of file is also filed in the court. The note sheets are filed in the court, which are considered as evidence, and then an inference is drawn that this is for a particular purpose. So these are all cases pertaining to bribery. Now, as Mr. Lahoti has mentioned, that the new this Amendment Act has come in 2018, you will see that a lot of changes have been brought. Now, prior to 1947, the private individuals were not prosecuted under Prevention of Corruption Act. So it's only in 1988 that the provisions with regard to individuals are also brought. Now, Section 7A and 8, which are brought, which have been introduced now, they are against individuals who are not public servants. Now, if they try to influence the public servant, they can be prosecuted. Whether public servant has been actually influenced or not is immaterial. But if a private individual takes money from someone by saying that I will influence that particular public servant and you will get the benefit, he can be prosecuted under the Act, the Section 7A and 8. Now, there are some, just to add one more line, there is a complication here. In many cases where private individuals are being prosecuted, the problem which we are facing is that investigating agencies are unable to identify the public servant. Suppose a call is intercepted that a private individual is taking money from another person in the name of a public servant who is not nominated, whose name doesn't come, and who's not even aware of the fact that a private individual is taking. How can there be a prosecution? These are gray areas where some cases are pending, but the issues are yet not decided by the courts. And then what has been introduced in the new amended act is that the corporate houses now can also be prosecuted. Earlier, there was a specific offense for the corporate houses, for the big companies. Now, Section 9 and 10 have been introduced. 9 is, I think, by a commercial organization. So, commercial organization word has been introduced, which means a partnership firm or a associate of persons, and some companies. They all are included. So they can separately be prosecuted. They can also be blacklisted if they are entering into bribe. And the officials of those companies who are aware of the bribing and who are consciously aware of the fact and whose consent is taken, they can also be prosecuted separately in Section 10. So these are all the new amendment. But what is most significant for you is the amendment in Section 13. Now, Section 13 of Prevention of Corruption Act, before the amendment, was a very elaborate section where all kinds of, acts, the acts of the government officials could have been probed. And it went on from 1988 till about 18. So for about 30 years, that definition worked, and many cases were registered and investigated under Section 13(1)(d). And we used to have a lot of problems when we used to argue in the court that a public servant has taken a decision, but he has not abused his official position. He has taken a call. It may be a judgment of error. There is no dishonest intention which is there, but his act is contrary to public interest. So the courts were flooded with those cases. And one significant judgment which came in 2011, which actually triggered the amendment, was a case of Department of Communication, Department of Telecommunication. That's a case of Mr. Supram, where a division bench of Delhi High Court interpreted, while deciding an appeal, convicting an accused person who had no dishonest intention, who was not involved in the crime, but his act was against the public interest, and his act has benefited to a third party. Suppose a secretary to the government is signing a file which results into benefit to a third party, but there is no quid pro quo, there is no mala fide intention, there is no mens rea involved, but he acts in good faith, and it turns out to be contrary to public interest. In that case, the Delhi High Court division bench says, yes, he can be prosecuted and punished. Now that started a new debate, that the honest officials If this is the interpretation, then honest official will stop working. Honest official will not take a call. He will feel that he can be prosecuted any time. So I think the discussion started in 2011. The appeal was filed in the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the government took action to protect the honest officials. And then in 2018, from 11 to 18 in 7 years, the amendment came. Now, the rigors of 13(1)(d) has been modified. It has been narrowed down. And the offense is only when the public servant has some pecuniary advantage, when he misappropriates, something which belongs to the government and which is entrusted to him. So it is narrowed down. And not many cases have been filed after 2018 because old cases are still pending. And since it is narrowed down, it is modified. So, and then many other provisions of PC Act which have come, which I'll just discuss it with you, which are creating an impediment for the investigating agency to file fresh cases. Now, as far as 13 is concerned, the most interesting proposition of law which give rise to this situation, which is important at this stage for all the lawyers who are working in criminal law and working particularly in Prevention of Corruption Act, is what is the fate of the cases which are being investigated and tried in the provision prior to the amendment. It is very significant. And I tell you, there is a total chaotic situation in the country. Many petitions have been filed, some are pending in the High Court, some are in the Supreme Court. No proper comprehensive judgment has been passed. So I don't know whether it's advisable for me to give my opinion, but since I'm also arguing those issues in the court, I'll just share with you briefly what my view is. My view is that when there is, in this case, the section 13 has been substituted. That means the old section 13 and the new section 13, the new one has substituted the old. And old is not protected. It is very important that when an act is repealed or it is amended or it is substituted, it has to be saved. And it is intentionally done. There's always a saving clause in all the statutes after the amendment. Now, in this case, what has happened is that the legislature, the parliament has deliberately not saved the earlier 13(1)(d). And although there is a saving clause there, but does not talk about this, it talks about the earlier amendment. Now, there are two saving clauses in the Act, section 30 and 31. They are talking about 1947 Act. That means the prosecution in 1947 are saved. They also talk about the IPC offenses, 161 to 165A. They are also protected. They are also saved. So all those accused who are facing trial in those offenses, they continue to face the trial today, and they can be, punished, convicted. Their appeals can be heard. But section 13 deliberately has not been saved. The only consequence of that is that it will be treated as if it never existed on the statute book. And the lawyers, those who are interested in this particular argument, I can share with them few important judgments which I have on retrospectivity. That if the amendment has come in 2018, whether this amended provision will have a retrospective applicability, and what will be the law when there is no saving clause. So I can share with you few judgments which are important. With regard to retrospectivity, I'm sharing with you many other judgments. There is a judgment in TADA. In TADA 1985-87, there was an amendment. Something was diluted. So it went on to the court, and the Supreme Court says, sorry, it's this amendment is a beneficial amendment to the accused. Therefore, benefit should be given to the accused in this case, and it should be interpreted in such a manner that benefit should be given, because Article 20 of the Constitution says that. And in this case, if the amended provision will be treated as if it never existed, how can there be an investigation or trial in this case? So there are few judgments. I can start with a judgment in Prevention of Food Adulteration Act. This is T. Barai versus Henry A.H. Ho. T. Barai versus Henry A.H. Ho, 1983, 1 SCC 177. And the relevant paragraph is paragraph number 18, which you should read. And then we have a judgment on retrospectivity in Probation of Offenders Act. And this is Ratan Lal versus State of Punjab, 1964, 7 SCR, page 676. This is a case of Probation of Offenders Act where again the provisions were amended and the benefit was given to the accused. It also talks about rule of beneficial construction. It's a very interesting judgment. And then State of Punjab versus Mohar Singh, 1955, 1 SCR 676. And Sundar Lal versus Municipal Corporation of Delhi, 1970, SCC Online Delhi, page 93. These are the judgment on retrospectivity. There are some judgment on saving clause, which I can share with you, which are also very important. That if there is no saving clause, just like in this case, there is no saving clause, what will be the interpretation? This is General Finance Company versus Assistant Commissioner of Income Tax, 2002, volume 7, SCC, page 1. And another important judgment of Constitution Bench is Kolhapur Cane Sugar Works Limited, 2000, volume 2, SCC, page 536. And another Constitution Bench judgment on saving clause is very, very interesting to read. It is Rayala Corporation Private Limited versus Director of Enforcement. Is under one. Adjudication, some judgment from the High Court or Supreme Court. I think a division bench of High Court in Delhi is hearing the matter, and it's also pending in Supreme Court, but never heard. So 13, as I told you, amendment issue is very important, and the definition has been curtailed because of the 13(1)(d) which was there. Now, what are the general propositions of law when we deal with Prevention of Corruption Act? When we deal with Prevention of Corruption Act, the first is the trap which I have already discussed with you. There is a law, there are almost 20-25 judgments on how a person can be convicted in a case of bribery under Section 7. So one very significant point which you all must note is that in all cases of bribery, it is important for the prosecution to prove that there was a demand. Demand is a sine qua non. If there is no demand, there can be no conviction. Again, there are many judgments on this issue. I would like you to write it down. Let me just see. Yes, I'll only give you 3 or 4 because I have a series of 17-18 judgment on this issue, but I'll give you 2 or 3 which are relevant, which covers the old cases also. Now, the most important bit you should note down is C.M. Girish Babu versus CBI. This is a judgment on demand, that in every trap, I'm talking about cases where trap has happened, accused is arrested red-handed, his hand wash shows change of color, but demand is not there, is not proved beyond reasonable doubt. Those are cases where Supreme Court has acquitted those accused person, that there may be a doubt, because you have to, the CBI has to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. So in case there's a reasonable doubt which is created in the case, the accused is acquitted. And this is one case. In every case, one has to see whether demand is proved or not. C.M. Girish Babu versus CBI, 2009, volume 3, SCC, page 779. And And I'll give you two more on this, and then in case you want to do research, you will find many judgments in these cases. 2014 volume 13 SCC, page 55, and if you want to see the latest, which has the older judgment which I refer to, is V. Sejappa versus State, 2016 12 SCC 150. So these are three cases, landmark judgment, which I have given to you, which you can read. There's a judgment of C.P. Rao, just note down the citation, it's important. 2011 6 SCC 450. C.P. Rao, 2011 6 SCC 450. So on section 7, these are the judgment. So primarily we have cases in 7 and we have in 30. And in 30, what is most important is that the prosecution should prove that the public servant had dishonest intention at the time of committing the crime. We have done so many cases where the public servants have acted rashly, negligently, but there is no dishonest intention on their part. Those are the cases where the Supreme Court has interpreted, and Supreme Court says, sorry, since there is no dishonest intention, they have to be discharged, or their FIR and charge sheets are quashed. Recently, we got a case quashed where a member of parliament was being prosecuted. It was discharged under 482. The FIR charge sheet was quashed primarily on the ground that that public servant never had any criminal intent. There was no mens rea involved while acting this. There are two judgments I would like to share with you on that, which you must read. These are very interesting reading, because these are the laws which which are applied when the relief is granted in the higher courts. One judgment which is very significant on dishonest intention is C.K. Jafar Sharif versus State. C.K. Jafar Sharif versus State is 2013, volume 1, SCC 205. And paragraph 14 to 19 are important, which talks about, in fact, this is 2013. So the judgment which is referred to in 13 is of 1963 Supreme Court. So you must note down the citation of that. 1963 Supplementary 2 SCR 724. This is M. Narayan Nambiar versus State. Now these two judgments are judgment which shows that the prosecution has to prove that there is a mala fide intent, there is a dishonest intent while abusing the official position. And M. Narayan Nambiar, the relevant paragraphs are paragraph number 6, 7, and 10. So these are on essential ingredients. Now, very significant provision of PC Act, which you all must know, is Section 20. Section 20 is a section in which the burden of proof changes. There's a presumption. So, normally there is an ambiguity in this argument. Not many lawyers and judges appreciate that. But what is important is that the presumption against the accused will be presumed only if the investigating agency prima facie satisfies to the court that yes, the essential ingredients of the offences are present. Please note down, it's very, very important. When we go to the court straight away, the judge says, sorry, there is a presumption against you. Why should I hear you at this stage? You please face the trial. You'll be acquitted. So at the stage of charge, when we argue, they show Section 20. When we argue at the stage of bail, they show, Section 20. Whenever you ask for discharge or quashing, Section 20 is read against the accused. But the most important argument in Section 20 is that the CBI has to prove the foundational facts of the case. That means the CBI has to prove that there was a initial demand, there was a subsequent demand, and there's a voluntary acceptance. There are cases in CBI where money has been put in the pocket of the public servant, or it is put in the drawer of the public servant. So the prosecution has to show that there is a voluntary acceptance of the money. So if these three facts are proved, by the investigating agency, only then Section 20 can be applied. Only then presumption can be read. So whenever this argument is put against you, that Section 20 says that there is a presumption, please cite judgments. I'll share with you one judgment on Section 20. Section 20, yes. State of Maharashtra versus Dhyaneshwar Lakshman. What I have just told you is incorporated in this judgment. That foundational facts of the case has to be established before Section 20 comes. 2009, Volume 15, SCC 200. Now, this judgment is relevant for Prevention of Corruption Act. This judgment can also be cited in many other statutes. In Prevention of Money Laundering Act, there is, presumption. In SFIO, there is in Companies Act, there is a presumption. In all these special statutes, they've incorporated the provision of presumption against the accused. So this judgment and many other judgments on the similar lines are important to cite, saying that please see whether the prosecution has proved the foundation facts of the case or not, and only then the presumption comes. Now, another aspect, Section 19, that is the most important, sanction for prosecution. The Parliament has amended Section 19 recently in 2018. Section 19 earlier, prior to amendment, was applicable only to the serving officials. That if you are in service, then the prosecutor or the investigating agency has to take sanction from the government for prosecuting you. But now, after the amendment, even retired government officials also have this protection. Why? There is a reason to it. Now, we have seen in the last almost 2-3 decades that when the sanction is not granted, when sanction is applied by the investigating agency and there is no response from the government, then the investigating agency waits for the officer to retire. And when he retires, then they file the charge sheet in the court, saying that Section 19 says only serving official, now he's not serving. So therefore, we are filing the charge sheet. In many cases, the charge sheets have been accepted also. And accused have been tried and they have been convicted without any sanction, because there was no requirement in law. Now the requirement in law is please procure, apply for sanction even against a retired official. Idea is to protect him. When the government does not grant sanction for prosecution, it means the government feels that he has not done any crime. It is being misinterpreted. The government is trying to protect his honest official. So therefore, this amendment is of great help to the officers who have retired. Now, another aspect which comes from here is how do we challenge the various orders. Section 19 also talks about a situation where the Act says that no court can stay the proceedings and no court will entertain any revision petition against an interlocutory order. Those provisions of law have been incorporated to make sure that the trials are expedited, trials are not halted unnecessarily in the court, no stay is granted, and for all that, just to speed up the Trials under Prevention of Corruption Act, all this happened. Now, again, this provision of law has been interpreted by the Supreme Court. I myself argued this case in the High Court, where at that point of time I was a standing counsel CBI, that since the Act says that no revision lies, so revision against order on charge is not maintainable. So this matter was argued before a revision bench of Delhi High Court, 2011, I think, where I in fact conceded before the court that yes, the accused should not be kept remediless. So therefore, 482 and Article 226 is a basic structure of the Constitution. So Article 226 cannot be denied, and 482 are inherent power of the court; they can't be denied. So therefore, these two are available. So from High Court, the matter was referred to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court finally decided a very significant judgment. Please note it down. This is Asia Resurfacing Road Agency Private Limited versus CBI. This is 2018, volume 16, SCC 299. This judgment is very important because the judgment says that the stay can be granted, but for a limited purpose, and that stay can't go on for more than 6 months. So I think it's you must read this judgment, which will give you an insight about the constitutional powers, the section 19, how it is interpreted, and the period for which the interim order can be passed by the government. So I have almost covered, I think, all sections from the beginning till 20, and after 20 there are other sections. There are general sections. One significant aspect which is introduced in PCI Act is the power to attach properties. Power to attach properties has been there earlier also. In 1944 there was an ordinance which was referred to in the Act but was never invoked by the CBI. They have just started invoking. I was myself very surprised when it was used in one of my cases about 5-7 years back, and then we have to do some research and find out whether 1944 ordinance actually exists or not. So now in the amendment they have introduced this, and they have brought in a section which deals with the attachment of property, and now CBI can also attach the property just like Enforcement Directorate does in the case of money laundering. So these are important provisions of law. Devekant, do you want me to continue, because this is such an elaborate act? I can go on for hours if you want to take.
There are some very pertinent questions which have been posted by our participants. I think when those questions are put to you, I think you will be able to cover more fields.
Yeah, please do it.
So one question has come from Mr. Salil Kumar Tripathi. What are the rights of an accused when a special investigation agencies like CBI interrogates a corruption case?
Okay, rights of an accused when he has just normal rights which every other person has. He has a right of silence, Article 20, Clause 3. His rights are valuable when the police is trying to extract something from him. Like what we see normally is that CBI writes a letter or a notice to the accused and says, please provide these documents under Section 91, as you say. So 91 is not applicable to an accused because it is directly in conflict with Article 20, Clause 3. So although accused has a right of silence, but he has a duty to cooperate with the investigating agency. So all those tools of extracting information from him can be curtailed because of Article 20, Clause 3. But he has a right to remain silent. That's a constitutional right available to any other accused. If you have any specific right, ask him. In case he has a specific right, then I can answer that.
All right, sir. Sir, I'll wait for his response. Now, sir, coming to the second question, sir, Mr. Vivek S has asked, I'm sure his clients would be facing this problem, and this problem would be a genuine problem. Would a public servant asking for a sexual favor also qualify as seeking undue advantage under the PC Act?
Okay. So let us read the definition of undue advantage which has been introduced. Okay. So I think it's very interesting. We can have, we can go on elaborate discussion on this. According to me, undue advantage also includes non-pecuniary demands, not money. Just like sexual favor is one of them. Asking for a gift, an expensive watch, an expensive car, or a house, or a property, or any other favor is also included. Undue advantage is Section 2D, which says means any gratification, whatever other than legal remuneration. So it is such a wide definition that everything is included. You make a demand which is uncalled for, so it's not a legal remuneration. Asking for a sexual favor is not a legal remuneration. And what is gratification? The word gratification is not limited to pecuniary gratification or to gratification estimated in money. This is not estimated in money. This is included. So this kind of favor, of course, is a favor which should be reported, and the action will be taken against the public servant.
Right, sir. So another question is put by Mr. Gopi Krishna Sood, and I think this is a question which is being a moot question in almost all the trials. If both the bribe giver and bribe taker refuse to be involved in the bribe, then how trial commence? Can a court or a magistrate take cognizance of such a matter?
No, come again. I don't understand the question.
Sir, he is asking if the bribe taker and bribe giver, both of them deny that they are involved in the bribe.
Yes, I think I've covered this, Vikrant, in my my talk with regard to traps where both bribe giver and bribe taker are involved because they are participating in the crime, and they will deny. So CBI has to independently prove the case from material which are available, like telephone conversations, movement of file, which I told you during my talk. These are independent evidence which can be collected by the CBI, and they have to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. They don't need the assistance of the accused, or because both of them are accused in this case. Right. So therefore, independent material available on record, that independent material can be used for filing a charge sheet in the court and even for conviction. Right. Obviously, both of them are accused. They will not. They will deny that they are involved in the case of bribery.
Right. So most of us are quite inquisitive about the fact that we face corruption every day in our life. So can an honest citizen who's a victim of corruption lay a trap for nabbing a corrupt public officer? And if he cannot, then what is the best way for him to bring the corrupt public officer to books? One option that you gave was to approach the CBI, but not in every case CBI would be receptive. Then in such situation, what should an honest public should do?
I think they can approach the Central Vigilance Commission. Central Vigilance Commission Act came, I think, somewhere in 2011-12, and Central Vigilance Commission has a supervisory power of the CBI, because even the prosecutions are monitored by them. The sanctions are monitored by them. So that's a supervisory authority. In case the investigating agency has not acted, because if a complaint is filed, they have not acted, you can go to a senior official, right? You can go to the Prime Minister office, write a letter to Prime Minister office, go to the CVC. These are agencies who can activate your complaint. But there is no independent way. The only independent way which I see now is because the Section 19 has been amended. And in Section 19, there's a provision of filing a private complaint. If a private complaint is filed before a court for an offense under 13(1)(d) or even under 7, you require sanction. So now the amended 19 deals with that situation. So therefore, from the Act itself, it now emanates that a private complaint can be filed. You can file a complaint in the court, tell the court that I'm applying for sanction, adjourn the matter for some more time, await for the sanction. If the sanction doesn't come, because there's an outer limit which is mentioned now, if the sanction doesn't come, the matter will be proceeded. So you approach higher authorities and also can file a private complaint because it is emanated from Section 19 now. And there's a proviso in Section 19 which says that the government has to respond in 3 months.
Right, sir. Now, sir, coming to another question, sir, which is raised by Mr. Parikshit Ahuja. Does the provision of seeking a sanction to initiate prosecution against a public servant not go against the basic principle of all being equal before law, thereby reducing transparency in the system and also allowing government to shield and protect their favored officers?
It happens, you're right. But we have to see the positive aspect of the matter. The positive aspect is every officer is not corrupt, and there is so much of competition in the services, in these services, where if you are doing so well, there is always someone who's trying to pull your leg. Very often we see that frivolous complaints are filed against these honest officials. So the moment these honest officials are prosecuted, their morale goes down, and then it has an impact on the other official also. So the provision of sanction is introduced in the statute only to protect those honest officials and to make sure that frivolous complaints are not filed. So therefore, if the government does not give the sanction for prosecution, that order can be challenged in the court. So I would like to tell my friend that the moment sanction is refused, it's not the end of the story. Actually, you have a remedy. So the CBI very often challenges those orders where sanctions are not granted and take it to the High Court, and those orders are set aside.
Right, sir. So
but it is very necessary that it should stay in the statute book, because we have to protect our honest officials.
So a similar question has been posed by Ms. Madhur Jawhar in respect of the recent amendment under Section 19. She's asked that the Amendment Act of 2018 provides for requirement to obtain prior sanction from appropriate government to initiate a probe on serving as well as former public servants. While the intent is to prevent victimization of honest officers, she asked, doesn't the amendment seemingly strengthen the shield available to officials accused of corruption?
I would like to tell my friend that she'll be surprised if I tell her that sanctions are granted in more than 90% of cases. You and I know in every case the sanctions are very few. We have very, very few minuscule percentage of cases where the sanction is not granted. Sanction is granted on a drop of a hat because CBI has to prepare a case. CBI files the charge sheet, and the time for appropriate time for approaching the government for sanction is when everything is concluded, when investigation is concluded. So therefore, it's very seldom you find that the sanctions are denied. So I don't think there's any anomaly in this provision as a whole. It should protect both the serving as well as the retired officials, and it should stay in the statute book.
Right, sir. So in the beginning of your talk, you have talked about that India doesn't have the system of private detectives. And the interrogatory agencies are CBI, EOW, and the kinds. Now, a question has been raised by Ms. Amrita Grover that with the growth in complexity of corporate and financial crimes, there have been instances of appointment of specialists for investigation on scheme crimes. As none of the legislation, Companies Act, PMLA, etc. provide for foreign agencies to be appointed for investigation, nor do they supply any model for conducting any investigation by foreign agency. Do you think that there should be a regulation for appointment of specialists such as private forensic auditors for investigation? Keeping in mind that enforcement agencies like CBI, ACBs, etc. are not sophisticated as required, and unfortunately, they are also prone to manipulation.
I think we have many instances where the private forensic companies are involved in the investigation, but those are in economic offenses. What we are discussing today are basically trap and criminal misconduct under Section 13. We don't need these forensic experts. These forensic experts are required when we are dealing with accounts, when we are dealing with the auditing part, when we are dealing with interpretation of documents. Out here, the CBI does take help of the forensic expert, but they are for handwriting, they are for voice sampling and voice reports, and they are for lie detector tests, and they are for narco analysis tests. All these tests are conducted where the specialist services are taken, and they all are available in India. But of course, foreign auditors, it's only when there's an economic offense. And CBI also must be appointing these new crimes which they are investigating, Nirav Modi, Mehul Choksi, with where majority of evidence is outside India. They certainly will be requiring help of those foreign companies because they have to collect the material and send it. Although legally in CRPC, it is only letter rogatories which are sent by the CBI, and letter rogatories are not answered for 10 years. You'll be surprised. Many, many years, these governments don't even respond to Indian government with regard to the evidence.
Correct, sir. And in fact, the problem of translation is also there. that if you don't send the letter rogatories in the official language of the country where you
Yes,
are, then they may reject to give information, right? So
yes, yes. I
similarly,
remember when I was, just to tell you, I remember I was standing counsel in 2011. A writ petition was filed where the accused company filed a petition and says that I'm facing prosecution for 5 years, nothing has happened. What CBI is doing, tell CBI to file a status report. And I was shocked to see when the investigating officer came to me and told me that for 5 to 7 years since the date when the investigation started, they have sent at least 15 letter rogatories to United States. Never responded. They didn't even bother to acknowledge the letter rogatories. Mind you, this is 2011. Things may be different today. Our international image has changed now. But 2011 they did not respond to 15 LRs. It was shocking.
so another question emanates from the newly substituted section 9 and 10, which now covers commercial organizations and person in charge of such commercial organizations within the ambit of section
Yes.
9 and 10, sir. So Ms. Pravina
Yes.
Bisht says that section 9 and 10 are so far they are concerned, they punish private corporations for giving the bribe and not accepting the bribe. She wants to know
Yes.
whether act of receiving the bribe by private entities can be considered as an offense under the scope of PC Act.
Yes, 7A and 8. Section 7A and 8 are for prosecuting the private individuals. If you read the heading of 7A, it says taking undue advantage to influence public servant by corrupt or illegal means or by exercise of personal influence. So a private individual accepting money from a third party that he will go and influence the public servant. That's against a private party. He's offering bribe to the public servant. And then 8, offense relating to bribing of public servant, where an individual has gone and bribed. So any person who gives or promises to give an undue advantage to another person, a person with intention to induce a public servant to perform improperly. So therefore, private individuals are covered in section 7A and 8, and also in abatement. Suppose they come and abate. If a private party, a company, or the officials are abating, they can be prosecuted separately in section 12.
Okay, sir. So another question has come from Mr. Roshan Santhalia. Is there any difference between quality of investigation conducted by CBI or anti-corruption branch, state police?
I think it's primarily the same because it's very difficult to file a case in CBI. So most of the cases are filed with anti-corruption branch of the local police. Their job is more or less the same. I find both of them are equal. And of course, it depends on an individual. Sometimes an individual officer is more competent than the other officer. But as far as agencies are concerned, their powers are the same. The law is the same. And I don't see there's any difference. It is just the only difference is in the access, how to approach them. Suppose you and I want to file a complaint. How do we approach the CBI? Can I go to the director directly? Right? I'm talking about from a common man's perspective. So that way, ACB is more accessible. The anti-corruption branch of state police is more accessible.
Right, sir. So one question has come from Mr. Sudhir Kumar. Are the intercepted calls admissible in court of law in the absence of public safety clause of Telegraph Act? And
Yes, I
similarly,
think it's very.
sir, one more question has come from Sumer, and he asks that whether a telephone conversation can be a sole evidence for conviction in a PC Act case.
So since the phones are being tapped very, very rampantly, and hundreds and thousands of them are being tapped every day, it is a very, very relevant question. And Indian Telegraph Act Section 5 is important. Investigating agency has to apply to the Ministry of Home and satisfy them that this is a case where some crime is happening and we want to investigate the matter. What they need to satisfy to the government is to show that it involves public safety and public emergency. Now these are very, very serious words which are used under the statute. But the way permissions are granted. Permissions are granted on a drop of a hat, according to me. Although there's a very significant judgment recently passed by Bombay High Court. I would like to share it with the viewers. I think I have a detail somewhere that this is a case of Vineet Kumar versus State of Bombay High Court. I don't know whether it's reported or not. I read it on the internet. Now, in this case, Justice Ranjit More has quashed those orders which are passed by Ministry of Home. You don't see this very often. Those 3 orders passed by the Ministry of Home granting permission to the investigating agency to intercept, that was quashed, all 3 of them, on the ground that they don't satisfy the requirement of Section 5 of Indian Telegraph Act. This is writ petition number 2367 of 2009. It's a division bench of Bombay High Court, and the date of the order is 22nd October 2019. Very interesting reading. It covers all the judgments. You will recollect, Mr. Lahoti, the judgment of Puranmal.
Yes, sir.
Where if an income tax raid is conducted, which is illegal, but some evidence is found by the investigating officer. Whether that evidence can be used, Puranmal says yes, it can be. Don't go by the illegality of the search. Okay. That is considered by the division bench.
Keeping aside,
even if the order is illegal, can the evidence be used? Then KT, this Puttaswamy's case on our right to privacy. 2007 judgment, that has been considered by the division bench of Bombay High Court, and ultimately they have held no, it is illegal, does not satisfy Section 5. The orders were quashed, and then even the material, the telephonic conversation which was intercepted and recorded by the police was set aside. And they said, sorry, you can't use this material. Very interesting reading. I was very impressed with the judgment. Okay. Very forward-looking judgment. Yeah.
So
it answers the query. But I would like to answer Sumair's query. Sumair says whether the telephonic conversation can be used for conviction or not. I would say yes, it can be used, but it can't be the only evidence. Okay. The telephonic conversations are used to corroborate the other independent material. There's a very significant judgment, I think, R.M. Makhani's case. I think you can note down R.M. Makhani's case, which says, this is 1973 1 SCC, page 471. Which says that telephonic conversation can be used only for corroboration. It can't be the sole basis for filing a case or for conviction. So when you have independent material and you also have telephonic conversation, then it can be used to corroborate, not the only material. That I think answers Sumair's query.
Right, sir. So and another question coming from voice samples, in respect of voice samples, from Divyadeep Arya. What is the remedy available with the accused who's a private person, where in the charge sheet voice sample is under doubt and still the magistrate is not discharging him under section 384 of the IPC?
Extortion.
Yes.
Okay. So how it is doubtful? The report says the voice don't match. You have to ask him, how is it doubtful? The doubtful report would be if the voices don't match.
Right, sir.
So I think he says that it is doubtful, means the report is in favor of the accused. It is not against the accused.
Sir, he has revised the question and said, what remedy accused can have for discharge if voice samples is under doubt, as mentioned in the charge sheet, and court is demanding trial under PC Act. So the veracity of voice sample is doubtful.
So again, if it is doubtful, then it has to be excluded. If it is excluded, we have to see what is the independent material available on record. Maybe the judge is satisfied with regard to the other material which are available on record. If other material are available on record and they give rise to a grave suspicion that he has committed the crime, then charges can be framed. But yes, if telephonic conversation is the only basis, then of course he has to be discharged. If it is not discharged, he has to challenge that order in the High Court.
In fact, sir, he has just clarified, saying that the voice is under doubt as per the charge sheet itself.
Yes.
Still the
magistrate exclude that. Yes. So exclude that and see the other material.
Right.
If magistrate is not doing, challenge that order in the High Court.
So now there are a couple of questions which are emanating from Section 6 of the General Clauses Act, sir, and many of our participants are asking that question. So one of the question is by Mr. Roshan Santhalia. Won't Section 6 of the General Clauses Act save Section 13 of the Pre-amended Act? And
No,
sorry, sir. And another question is asked by Mr. Hemant Shah. He says that Section 30 of the PC Act, prior and post amendment, talks about Section 6 of the General Clauses Act as far as savings is concerned. Section 6 of the General Clauses Act deals with amendment, whereas Section 7, 8, 9, 12, and 13 have been substituted. So his question is, shouldn't Section 6A of General Clauses Act apply, and thus saving clause should not apply in the new act?
So I think the Mr. Hemant Shah's question answers the first question.
Right, sir.
Because if he's saving clauses, because I had cited 2-3 judgments just for their help, that in case there is absence of saving clause, then what is the law? These are all constitution bench judgment. Just to give them the idea, General Finance Company case, Kolhapur cane sugar case, and Rayala Corporation case, both are of Supreme Court. All three of them are from Supreme Court Constitution Bench, which says what will be the impact if there is no saving clause. So in this case, admittedly, the saving clause 30 and 31, they also refer to the General Clauses Act. So in the amendment, there is no saving clause, number one, and there is no reference of Section 6 General Clauses Act. So the clear-cut intention of the Parliament is they never wanted to save it. That is why they have not, saved it specifically. Otherwise, when such a exhaustive amendment act has come, where all these sections, there's an application of mine, there's a report of Law Commission of India before the amendment has taken place. Why they have excluded this? Because it is deliberately done. The law is very clear on that. The law is, if there is no saving clause, then please see what is the intention of the Amendment Act. The intention, we have to read the language of the Amendment Act. The language is very clear. They have substituted the new offense. They have clarified what the offense would be, and without saving the earlier one. So we have to interpret we have to see amendment as a whole. We have to see the saving clause, and we have to see why saving clause is not done. Read the judgment on saving clauses, and also see that Section 6 General Clauses Act, although exists, but not deliberately mentioned in the amendment. So if we have a combined reading of all this, then the only interpretation is Parliament never wanted to save it. That's what we need to argue in the court.
Right. So one question has come from Yagnesh Nasa. Considering the technological advancement, now a citizen is empowered to gather evidence against wrongdoer themselves, maybe by call recording, audio recording, or video recording, etc. Will these evidence be admissible, assuming that they are authentic?
If the matter is investigated by an agency and the complainant has some evidence, then it is his duty to give it to the investigating agency. He can't use it himself because it's a state case.
Right.
All these cases which are investigated by the independent agency, those are state cases. The CBI case is CBI's prosecution. So yes, you are a complainant. You have evidence available with you. You have to give it to them so that they can test it. Independent investigating agency's job is to conduct independent investigation. Their job is not to bolster the case of the complainant. They have to find the truth. So as a complainant, we are always very exuberant to prove our case because we are interested in prosecution. We want to teach a lesson to the accused person. But CBI's job is not to teach lesson to anybody. CBI is to independent. So your material can be given to CBI. CBI will evaluate. If it is worth relying upon, they will rely upon and file it with the charge sheet.
Now, sir, another question has come from Ms. Vindhya Mehra. Whether an offense of corruption by a government servant or a private person is compoundable?
Yes. This is again a gray area. It's debatable. We have to, in case it's compoundable, we have to go back to Section 320 because CRPC is applicable in Prevention of Corruption Act cases. If it is mentioned in the schedule which is mentioned in 320, of course, if the section covers, it will be. But if we analyze all those sections, you will see wherever a public servant is involved as a complainant, it's a non-compoundable offense.
Right.
Even 188 which is punishable for only 1 month, is non-compoundable because public servants are involved. So most of the offences are offences where public servants are not involved.
So another question has come from Mr. Rahul Maheshwari. What will be the effect of amendment on the cases where prosecution has been initiated after the retirement stroke transfer of an accused? Will the prosecution be null and void and the CBI will have to take a fresh sanction, or will it go without sanction?
Now again, this has not been decided by any court as of now because this amendment has just come, and we will have to argue in the court that it's a beneficial provision. This provision gives benefit to the accused person, so it has to be liberally construed. It should be construed for the accused person. So as of now, the situation has not come. But if situation comes, then we'll have to show that at least this provision, because our argument would be that it doesn't have a retrospective effect. But when we talk about effect, we talk about rights of the accused, whether it is diluted, but how provision is given in favor of the accused. You can always make an argument saying that I should be given the benefit of this provision because this has come and my trial is pending. So it should be used in the court to take advantage of this provision. And I think I'm sure it's a debatable issue. It's a very arguable point.
So we are flooded with the questions, but the time doesn't permit us to go further, sir. We have limitation of time. But it was a wonderful session, sir. Many queries were answered, and in many queries, the law is yet to be decided by higher courts. With this, sir, I'm really thankful to Manav Rachna University and you for having such a wonderful session. Ajay, to you.
Thank you, Divyakant. Ladies and gentlemen, I would echo what Divyakant has said. I think that was an excellent exposition into the letter and practice of anti-corruption laws in India. Mr. Pava, thank you for sharing your tremendous knowledge, your experience and insights, and most importantly for your time. We truly appreciate your support to this initiative. Thank you.
I will say only one thing, Ajay, that coming back on how I started, that it's very important that we must have more sessions like this because we all have so much of time. We are quarantined at home. We should give benefit to the youngsters. And although, you have also spent a couple of hours today and then few hours yesterday also and, planning all this, but we have to do it consistently because this is, according to me, the most productive time for a lawyer. So please, if you want me to request some lawyers, I will, but let's continue to have this at least once in a week or maybe once in 10 days so that our young friends are benefited from this. So stay safe, stay at home, stay quarantined. You have to follow the guidelines issued by the government and be safe.
Right, sir. So
thank you, Mr. Pava. We definitely will keep this in mind. And as a matter of fact, this is a series of law dialogues. In fact, this is the second in that series of law dialogues. And the idea is that this will be done on a periodical basis. And we're hoping we can do it on a weekly basis now that we have the attention of all senior lawyers. As you rightly said, they're all quarantined at home. So definitely that's something we're going to keep in mind. And Divyakant, how can I forget you? Many thanks for very efficiently moderating the session. It's never easy moderating online sessions. So I think you did a wonderful job, very diligently looking into questions which have been raised by attendees and putting them to Mr. Pava. And finally, last but not the least, can I take this opportunity to thank all of you attendees for taking the pains of registering and attending this webinar. We truly appreciate your support to this initiative of the Manav Rachna Law School, and we hope to see you more often at future editions of these Manav Rachna Law Dialogues. So ladies and gentlemen, on that note, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.